Need to adjust that clock.
I know, it's that bar time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 47th meeting of the Honolulu Liquor Commission. This is a special meeting with only one agenda item, so we're going to move directly into our hearing agenda. Calling another business agenda item number 1, Liquor Commission, presentation of Wei Chen, Strategic Advisor of System Review of Liquor Commission Enforcement Section. Ms. Chen, could you please make your name for the parents for the record?
Yes, my name is Hui Chen. I'm strategic advisor in the managing director's office, and I am the lead reviewer for the system review.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. The liquor commissioners are in receipt of your report that you have provided to us. That is before us. We have had the opportunity to review that report. As you are probably well aware, that report has also been made public.
Yes.
Any references to that report, we have the ability to reference in our materials at our desk.
Great.
I would like to afford you as much time as possible to present your findings, and your systems review is very comprehensive, and I know you probably have a lot to get through. Before we get to that, however, I would like to provide just a brief procedural history in this matter. There are people in the room and people listening online who may not have attended prior hearings and may not know how we got here. So I'd like to provide some brief context for the record and then also provide some initial comments.
Sure.
So in or around March of this year, I believe the managing director's office appeared before this commission with a request to consider the engagement of Ms. Chen and her team to conduct a systematic review of the policies, procedures, systems, etc. of this agency, and in particular, the enforcement division of this agency. We listened to the managing director's request. We were fortunate enough to be able to discuss this with Ms. Chen at the hearing. She was available to answer questions. And we, as a commission, unanimously engaged Ms. Chen and her team to conduct this review. I believe, broadly speaking, we did so for 3 basic reasons. The first is that I think this commission needed this sort of review. As a commission, we are relatively new. We've only been on the commission serving for a year or a little bit more. And we're not here day to day. So with all of the concerns in the public and in the internal complaints that we were seeing, et cetera, we felt that we needed a comprehensive review that would enable us to understand the facts and circumstances as they are and allow us to make any determination as to what was necessary in terms of action steps. Second, we believe the public needed a report of this nature. There's been concerns in the public, there's been complaints. There's been formal complaints and informal complaints. Myself as a private practice attorney, hear some of those informal complaints. And we believe that it was necessary at this stage for the public to know what was going on, to understand what was happening within this agency. And then together in a public and private partnership, we could understand how to effectively address those issues. And the third is the team that was in front of us. Ms. Chen, your resume was part of the package. We were able to review that. We were able to really see your depth of expertise in this field. We were able to understand the work history and extensive experience that you have and the success stories that you have, both on the state and federal level. So we were very impressed by that record, but at least for me, I was also equally impressed with your demeanor at the hearing. Your intellect, and for us, it was a sign that you would be able to conduct this systematic review in a very effective manner. And it was essentially what we needed in this moment and at this time. So we had every confidence that we would be provided a comprehensive, a fact and data-driven analysis and a very candid and honest analysis. And that's what we needed. And I believe that's precisely what we received. So I do want to extend my gratitude to you, Ms. Chen, to your team. We believe, we haven't heard your statements, but we do have to report. And even from that, we believe that you have provided us with a very comprehensive assessment as to the condition of this agency, at least as it pertains to the enforcement division, and in some conclusions and recommendations as to how to move forward from here. So thank you very, very much. I was going to stop there, but I do actually also want to acknowledge the public. Thank you all for being here. There are people in this room that have taken time out of your afternoon to be here and to be present and to listen to this hearing. I understand this hearing is also being streamed online, so there are countless others that are listening in at home or at their office. Thank you for participating. And I think that speaks to the vital nature of this hearing and what we're doing here today. We are a public agency and we are public servants, and I think those are used colloquially a lot and sometimes in a derogatory fashion. But I do think it speaks to a certain level of ethical standards that we, as a public agency and as public servants, need to provide to the public, and a level of transparency and ensure that what we're doing at this agency and how this agency is operating is at its best. And this report and the findings and conclusions and the recommendations that you have, Ms. Chen, and the action steps that we will take moving forward speak to that public-private partnership and the ability for us to come together to speak in an honest and meaningful dialogue, and to really get to action steps that will provide us with a pathway forward. So I really do sincerely want to appreciate and express my thanks to the public for being here, for listening in, and for being involved in this process. I think I'll stop there because I do want you, Ms. Chen, to have some time, and I'm a bit long-winded already, but I do want to just briefly ask my fellow commissioners if you have any initial opening statements or comments that you'd like to make.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Buckley. Yes, I'd like to thank the mayor's office for providing us with you, Ms. Chen, and your team as you help the commission improve our operations. They say where there's smoke, there's fire, and pre-day one, it was obvious there were many blazes happening here in the organization. We're looking forward to your analysis helping us to prioritize our resources in addressing these fires. I'm daunted that your recommendations are only part of the amount of work that we have here to do. Right? We still have to take action on the external investigation of complaints that have been backlogged. Commissioner Hollinger often notes multiple times that we should conduct a similar study and systems analysis of our licensing processes as well. And all of this as we search for new senior staff. For the public, I would like to note that due to sunshine laws, the commission received a report on Tuesday and with the public agenda of this meeting. And this is the first time we actually all have a chance to discuss it together. I did have the pleasure of working with you on the gathering of some of the data for your report. And I come with a technology background, and my technology colleagues were rather shocked and surprised at the status of our current IT systems. The commission has established the IT systems analysis permitted interaction group in anticipation of gathering more information on the IT systems. And I would ask that you highlight any of these areas as you go through your presentation. Additionally, on page 51 of your report was the disturbing footnote that a matter was referred to HPD. Could you please address this item when we get to it? And also highlight any other potential criminal activities that you would like to bring in front of the commission, preferably here, but in executive session if necessary. I'm sure we all agree that we have to be aggressive and transparent in addressing any criminal activities discovered as part of our reform of the system. Against the weight of your report, I was encouraged. The staff are aware of shortcomings and they're anxious for change. They want to take pride in the vital service that we provide to the community. We are at a unique time where the mayor's office is actively assisting us with obtaining your and others desperately needed outside support. The city council has mandated change, and the public through complaints and lawsuits is demanding change. I'm confident the commissioners and with the new administrator and senior staff will address many of the shortcomings in your report. And I would ask if you and the mayor's office are amenable that you return next year and provide us with a progress report on changes that we've made and areas that we could do improvement on. And I would like to ask the commission to ensure that we have budget for this item.
Thank you, Commissioner Hong. Thank you very much. And I do very much echo the comments from Commissioner Hong, and I do just want to make the simple statement that change is happening. I mean, the fact that we're here today evidences that. Are we done? Of course not. Your report is abundantly clear that we have work to do. And Commissioner Hong just mentioned other work in addition to this that is necessary. And we look forward to doing that and to working with the public to find ways to continue to progress and make changes that are necessary for the better of this agency. So with further ado, Ms. Chen, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking the commission for entrusting me with this review and to thank the Liquor Administration, Ms. Hirai, Ms. Reyes, for your and Investigator Fontaine and all the members of the team who participated in interviews and document productions for their cooperation in the process. I also want to thank Ms. Sewell and Mr. Prager for their invaluable assistance. I could not have done this by myself without their valuable assistance. I think I want to also note, for me, who does a lot of this types of organization reviews and investigations, how incredibly unusual it is for this to be done in a public atmosphere. So when I normally do this in private practice, this is usually done under attorney-client privilege so that every single piece of information can be protected to the maximum. For a public agency, for an organization to want to encounter this type of challenge in this very public way, I think it's courageous. And I also think it's a commitment to public service that really needs to be applauded. So I really do applaud the commission's decision to proceed in this manner. So before I go to report, I want to also emphasize again, focus of the system review. From the time I first came to the commission in February, and also in my report, I have repeatedly emphasized that this is not an investigation, it is a system review. And I've said this in every one of my interviews. And the reason that here's the distinction, an investigation typically has the purpose of trying to prove or disprove specific allegations or conducts. A system review has the goal of trying to understand how a system operates and how to improve it. So I want to stress that because when people see a report that's not glowing, there is a natural tendency to look for someone to blame. That's oftentimes the first reaction. Who is at fault? Who is culpable? I think the worst thing we can do right now is to start pointing fingers, especially if we start pointing fingers at women and men who currently work in this agency. The challenges I've noted in my report are the results of long time systemic issues. If you took new cooks and put them in a kitchen with hot plate, a rusty pan, and no recipe, you cannot blame them for not serving you a Michelin-starred meal. Throughout this interview, I did not meet a single individual who struck me as acting in bad faith. What they all wanted was to do their jobs in the best way they knew how. And what they all need is to be equipped, guided, and supported. If we play the blame game and we direct the blame to the people who work here, we make it a worse place to work, and we make it that much more difficult to attract good people. And that's not an outcome that anyone would benefit from. So instead, I'd like to see us resist that impulse to blame and really focus on how we can improve. And what I hope to see is that all the stakeholders in our community can step forward to help make this agency a place where good people can proudly and effectively do public good. So for the time we have today, I'd like to propose the following. The report has been prepared to speak for itself in its entirety. So I'm going to assume the commission and any interested party has had the time to study the report and have questions. So I suggest that I do not go through this report slide by slide, because I don't think we'll have enough time for that. But for each section, so I propose that we go through it by section. And for each section, I can provide a very brief, and I do 1 to 2 sentence highlight, and then really just open up for questions that you may have and you want to discuss. The only thing I would ask for is that I like to spend more time discussing the recommendations, and particularly some of my thinking behind that. Why do I think some of the recommendations address the issues that I have found? So I just like to ask that we reserve at least 30 minutes for the recommendation discussion if we start to run out of time. Is that acceptable to the commission?
Yes.
All right. So on the projection we have, what we're doing, do I need to do anything here?
Do we want to project the?
So we can project, but let's hold off for now. Let me just go through by section, and if anyone references a specific slide, we can go there. So the introductory section, review origin, methodology, background, context. I think they speak for themselves. Any questions or points for discussion? I think the only thing I would note for that is just how severely understaffed this agency is. And that really does have an impact on everything. As we think, and we do need to keep that in mind as we move forward with recommendations. Everything, honestly, is always easier said than done. When you go to implement these, somebody's got to do all those tasks that's necessary to make something happen. And right now, they simply don't have enough bodies. And so I think that's a significant context that we need to know. The next overall section is on culture. For that section, my very high level observation is for enforcement unit itself, the lack of what I call a playbook. So this is the policies and procedures and standard operating process. There isn't one place where someone can go to and say, how do we do this? What is our standard operating procedure for this? It's very much by word of mouth. It's very, it's very subjective in some ways, because since you don't have a playbook to go by, you try to make the best decision you can, given what you know. And so that's what really struck me in terms of the culture there. I also think it is a very difficult environment to work in many ways. Your work time is 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. And for people who have families, that means you probably don't get to see your family all that much. And you go into nighttime establishments that serve alcohol. Alcohol is not known for bringing out the best behavior in people. And so you're going into situations that can be rowdy, that can be noisy, can be combustible. And so going out at night, doing this job at night after night is difficult. And that understandably creates a dependency with each other. It's an atmosphere where when you work with folks that, that closely in that kind of atmosphere, you really need to trust each other. And you need to build that relationship where you do listen to what each other says. And that combined with that lack of playbook, I think makes room for a lot of subjective decisions that are not necessarily informed by data. So that's the overall observation for the enforcement section. I think for the overall section, for overall agency, I was struck by the sense of that lack of trust that seems to exist. It's a small organization. There are only 30 people working here right now, and many of them are not talking to each other. Some of them have complaints filed against each other. When someone has a complaint, they don't go to this other person and say, you know what? I don't think I got enough training. Can you do more training? Or I don't like the way you talked to me yesterday. Can we talk about that? They file a complaint instead. Nothing wrong with filing a complaint, that's your legal right to do. But I think in such a small organization, the number of complaints and the issues that have driven those complaints really did strike me as a display of a lack of trust, a lack of collegiality among people who really should be working very closely together. So I'll pause there, and those are my sort of high-level remarks for the culture section.
Commissioners, do you have any comments or questions for Ms. Chen regarding the culture portion of her system?
Yes, Ms. Chen, I believe one of the items that you rather highlight, right, is that some of the modeling of the agency in enforcement is HPD based, and inherently this is more of having a safe environment for serving alcohol, which is different than enforcing criminal law. And I wanted to know if you want to highlight those areas now or wait until we get into the policy?
No, I'm happy. I mean, that's a theme that does run throughout this report as well. I noted that from the culture section all the way to the end, including my recommendation to diversify the culture orientation. I think there's an important difference between law enforcement and regulatory enforcement. And I think that distinction has been overlooked. Law enforcement enforces all kinds of laws, criminal laws, and they're conducting usually investigation in reaction to an allegation, in reaction to an event. So that's why they cannot just come into your home unless you give them permission or they have a search warrant. Regulatory inspection can come into an establishment without a warrant, because what they're doing in terms of enforcement is very specifically limited to that topic that they're enforcing. So here it's an enforcement of liquor laws and regulations. And because of that distinction between regulatory enforcement and law enforcement, oftentimes you should have very different mindsets about how you go about it. But what I have observed is really, particularly with the field services, so that's both licensing and enforcement, there's very strong HPD sort of influence and legacy. We note the policies bear remarkable resemblance. There are policies, and we'll get in, we see more of that in the policy section. And there are policies, I don't even know why they're there, because those are, search warrants, lineups, detention. That's what a police officer does, not what liquor inspectors do. Why are they in the policy? So I think there is that heavy influence. There is that presumption that this job is just like HPD, when it's actually very different. And I think that difference really needs to be attended to. Anything else?
Yes, I think it's more of a comment, but there may be a question here somewhere. I was impressed at the honesty and candidness of the interviewees of the staff. That's often difficult, I presume at least, difficult to extract out of these types of reviews. And I think that one speaks to your ability and your expertise to do that. So again, we thank you for that. But I think it also speaks to the fact that a lot of these employees and staff, maybe all of them, want a better environment internally. They want policies
They do.
to help them. They want training to make sure that they have the expertise they feel they need to do the job and do it well. And for me, that was one of the more alarming pieces of the system review as a whole, because perhaps it's just my philosophy, and this goes far beyond this agency, but the value of our workforce and our people cannot be underestimated. And if we provide an environment that's supportive of our employees, that provides them with training, that provides them with policies that allow them to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing and how to do it, training to make them feel like they can do the job and do it well. If our goal is to create an environment that allows our employees to thrive and allows them really to be the best version of themselves, then that is going to be front facing to the public when they're doing their job. And I think one of the fundamental breakdowns is internally when we're not providing that type of support to our employees. And again, I think this is any organization, not just an agency. But to me, that is one of the core elements that I want to see addressed. And I know you've made recommendations on that. And that's multifaceted, our policies and procedures and training and hiring and whatnot. But for me, that was a big anyway, was the extreme need to change the internal culture of the agency and to provide our staff with the appropriate tools and training policies that I need. Commissioner Hong mentioned this in his opening remark, and you mentioned this too. I think everyone here generally wants to do a good job. I don't think there's ill intent. I don't think there's an intent to do bad in the community, but they're stuck. And part of our job is to help get them unstuck and give them the tools and things that they need to really thrive and be the best version of themselves. I guess there's not a question.
No, but I would like to respond to that. I completely agree that these employees they really do want to be good at their jobs. And they also really want to be heard. And I think one of the things that we just as a society don't do well enough is really listen to each other. And here are employees that in some of the worst times, particularly during COVID, we asked them to go into, you can consider dangerous situations. And then when things didn't go well, they feel like they get blamed. But nobody is bothering to hear their side of the story. And when I met with them, and I said to them in every interview that my job is here to listen to you because we want to change things for the better. I don't do your job. You do this job. You know what's needed to make this better. And what I'm hoping that I have done is to reflect some of those suggestions and sentiments that they've had. And I also find it, it was very, it was a good experience when, in the beginning of every interview, I tell them that you are free to terminate this anytime. In fact, you can walk out right now. If you're represented by counsel, you can have your counsel available. You can not answer a particular question if you're in control of this. So I recall there was one particular interview where the person, after I said this, said, I'll stay a little. And then at the end, this person went on, like we're at time, and I signaled that the interview was over, but this person had more to say. He kept wanting to, continue to share his thoughts. So I think that really just reflects how much they want to be heard. And I would love to see overall that we can create more of these opportunities. I mean, that's the thought behind some of the recommendations is, for people to have more opportunities to work with each other, to have their opinions be part of the system input in changing things.
Thank you. That's encouraging in its own way. I do have one question, and feel free to defer this to later because I feel like it may be more appropriate when we discuss other sections. But when Commissioner Hong mentioned HPD-based police powers came up in my mind, and the fact that we have certain police powers. And my question is, should we, is that appropriate? Is that something that we need to look at maybe from a rulemaking standpoint or a policy standpoint? So if you want to discuss it in the policy and rulemaking, we can do that, but that was. my
I think I only have a very, so I can, I think that's something that the commission should certainly consider revisiting in terms of what police power it believes is appropriate to retain or to gain or to give away. I think that's the kind of issue that really should be revisited on a regular basis anyway. So, sorry, I posed that I made that sound more like a question, so that was actually not.
Commissioners, any other questions for this section?
This might be a lot of out of order. Something that I had wanted to do that you mentioned in your recommendations was the ride along.
Yes.
And two things. One is to experience what the job entails. But the second one is as a soft channel of having voices heard. And if when the time comes, we want to maybe talk about that experience as well.
I didn't go on it.
Oh, I thought you did one.
No, Ms. Sewell
Oh, okay.
was the one who attended. I think I'm too old to stay out at through that. So, but I very much believe in this walk at least a minute in someone else's shoe approach. And when I was younger, as a prosecutor, I had gone on ride-alongs with police officers and agents. That was precisely what I wanted to do. Was I present their cases in court, and I want to understand how those cases, what was happening with those cases when they were on the ground. And so that was something that Ms. Sewell was able to do. And I also think it gave us an opportunity to really just interact with the investigators in their work environment as people. And I think that was, I think that's an experience that I think you would benefit from, and they would also benefit from the interaction with you.
Yeah, I agree. Any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I did want to make a comment in the culture section. I thought it was a breath of fresh air to see that during interviews, you were able to, fully connect with the staff and get information from them to understand how it is. And based off kind of what you said in that cultural center, I can see how it can be construed as a lack of trust because there is lesser people here. And the more bodies you have, obviously, the more ability you have to spread people out. So I was glad to see that there was a breath of fresh air in that area of being able to get people to talk with you.
I think really it wasn't anything other than a genuine willingness to listen. And I think that can come from anyone. So thank you. Policy and procedures, I think I've been quite explicit and about my observations. So I'm not going to sort of put further editorial on it. I'm just gonna let you ask questions that you might have.
Okay, so a question that I have that I'm slightly embarrassed I don't know the answer and I'm looking for you to, was the criteria for conducting inspections, both random and targeted. And is that something that was policy driven, that's obsolete, or is just handed down through oral history?
There is a policy, and forgive me, I can't recall the policy number, and clearly it would be somewhat dated, probably one of the 2006 policies that addresses sort of, if I recall, categories of licensees who should be inspected. So I vaguely recall sort of, there should be restaurants and dispensers and whatnot, but there was no for example, percentages. It sort of names a few categories and say, these should be included. But I think the bigger point is that this policy is just not known. I mean, not one person referred to this policy. And this was the case with most of the policies, that even when there's clearly a policy on something, nobody referred to it. And I will say, once again, I don't blame them, because if you were to make an attempt to look at the policies and the first thing you see is things that completely do not apply to your job, why would you continue looking? Right? I pick up let's say someone did pick up a policy manual and they start looking and go, oh, arrest warrants, search warrants, detention. This is not for me. I'll probably put it back. So I think the policy being the way it is not striking people as a helpful resource. So therefore, it's sort of in the corner.
Thank you.
I think I have less questions on this section and more I want more insight onto your recommendations, because I believe your report essentially says we're starting with a blank canvas. And we're going to have to work from there, at least for the internal policies. But what I did want to ask, well, at least first clarify, is the policies and procedures in this section is dealing with both internal policies that are adopted at maybe an administrator level, let's say, and the administrative regulations that are set forth in the, well, first Hawaii revised statutes and second, the Hawaii administrative rules. Are you including both of those types of policies and procedures in this section?
Sorry, let me just make sure I can understand before I read that. Would you mind repeating that question?
Sure. So from my perspective, there are kind of two broad sets of policies and procedures. One are the internal policies that are handled internally.
Yes.
They're discussed and passed internally by staff here. The second are regulations that are
The liquor rules.
given to us by either the Hawaii legislature for the Hawaii revised statutes or the Hawaii administrative rules.
Okay.
And we have some control, at least over the Hawaii administrative rules. We have much less control over the Hawaii revised statute. So I'm wondering, are you analyzing all of that in this section?
My focus was primarily on the internal.
Okay.
And I do think the internal is probably a more urgent if I compare the two, but you know, my personal view with any laws, regulations, policy and procedures that they all should always have a regular review cycle. Whether it's, you know, I would say a minimum of 3 years, that, you know, every policy should have a review cycle. I mean, it could be 5 years. I think anything beyond 5 can be a little bit, you start getting into the possibly things get stale and outdated range, but for the internal policies, they're way beyond that. Right. And they're so clearly they're so clearly irrelevant to the investigators' work when they should be very relevant to their work. And so I think that's really the more urgent piece. I think my brief look at, you know, the liquor rules, I think there's probably, I pointed out a couple of places where it could probably be modernized. Right. So the assumption in some of those rules was from, I think, a slightly different era. So.
Yeah, and just by way of example, I know from representing nonprofit organizations that the IRS requests/requires review every 5 years of internal policies. So,
exactly.
There's precedent in other areas that would go to your point. Commissioners, any other questions in this section? Okay, Ms. Chen, please proceed.
Okay. Then we go to the sort of recruitment, training, evaluation, promotion section. The recruitment, as you saw, if I wanted to apply for a job as an investigator, I could not find how to do it. And given the number of vacancies, I think that's a significant concern. So, and there have been, in some of the interviews, there have been discussions about, you know, trying to be more creative and proactive in recruiting. I'm not aware of specific plans to do so, but there's certainly awareness of the need to do more active, proactive recruitment. Training, everybody wants more. There was not one person I talked to who says, I think we have enough training. They all want more. They want more structured training. They want recurring training. They want training, I think that's relevant to what they do. I mean, the trainings that they have recounted to me that I reported in the report, some of them just did not seem to be that directly relevant to what they do, right? So, you know, why the psychological profiling training for, you know, that just not something I imagine they would do every day. So it sounded like some of the trainings they've gone to were really designed for law enforcement agencies. And I think it would be beneficial if they got more specific trainings relating to what they do. So that's the training piece. The evaluation, what struck me was that there's just there's no documented standards. Nobody knows what, so I would ask people like how do you know you've done a good job? How do you know what you have to do to pass probation? And there are sort of general idea, you need to be able to write good reports, you need to have good rapport with the licensees, you need to work well with people. So sort of common sense knowledge about what you think you should, how do you evaluate someone in this job? But there is nothing documented. There is nothing that really tells people, here are the 5 things that we're going to evaluate you on, and really focus on trying to address particular areas where they need to perform. There's just, the evaluation form, which is actually not unique to this agency, is a citywide form. You saw it's unsatisfactory and satisfactory, basically. And that really, to me, is not very helpful. And what I think is also interesting is how that plays into promotion. So promotion, from what I could gather, was largely dependent on, I assume, satisfactory performance up to the point you apply for the promotion. And then you have this one interview that's by external stakeholders. What if you're just someone who's very good at your job but doesn't do well in interviews, right? Or vice versa. And I also think the interview questions, I gave examples of them. I was puzzled, and I would tell you, I'm a trained lawyer, and I'm a former federal prosecutor, and I could not answer that Fourth Amendment question. So I don't know what that has to do with the liquor investigator's job, and I don't know why that question is there. So some of those questions that I think are just, again, I think we're talking about HPD legacy and influence there. So those are my sort of high level observations on that section. Any questions?
Okay, so to the extent that there is promotional career path within the investigative side, or maybe you can move within the city, do people express a desire and a career path, see a career path within the Liquor Commission itself, or as a stepping stone to somewhere else? Like, what's the general feeling?
I think the general feeling, some people come into this position in hoping that this will lead to other law enforcement opportunities. So that's not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a perfectly fine system if we basically attract people who see this as an entry-level job and want to move somewhere else. And then there are, but ultimately you do want to at least retain some of the people who can bring that experience into more supervisory roles. I think right now, given the public scrutiny and the low staffing, morale's low. And, I will say, there's one question that I asked almost everyone, which is, if someone you cared about asked you, hey, you work at the Liquor Administration, I'm thinking about working there, what would you say to them? I think with the exception of one person, not one person would recommend it. And to me, that's very sad and telling. And it ranges, right? So some of them would say, this could be a good job, but not now. But some of them would say, no way. And because the experience for them has been difficult. And I think if you're thinking about recruiting and building up this agency, that's something that needs to change.
I think you cited it later on in your report in things we need to look forward to do in the future. But training, I know you had noted specific areas. Were there other areas that you had thought about, like other, not areas, but I guess I think you cited a specific liquor and
The National Association.
Yeah. I mean, I think if there's other, were there other training areas that you saw or thought of that, I mean, besides that, I mean, obviously, training is something, reading through the training portion, everyone is stating that, you know, they want more of a more structure. And I think the more places we can find structure for it.
Yeah.
Would give them more opportunities. You know, obviously, the better trained you have someone, the more efficient and able to handle the task that they may come across.
Yeah.
Is there. So I was just wondering if you had other further ideas in regards to just that one agency.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So there's been suggestion from, I think, externally as well as from some of the investigators I interviewed that, you know, for example, they should be like HPD and have an academy, but they don't have enough people to run a regular academy. You have to have a certain volume to be able to run a regular academy. If you're only getting two new people every 3 months, you can't run an academy on that. So I think what we have to do is really just think out of the box and you know, think about how do we get them more structured training that's liquor enforcement focused. So the National Association idea was that, you know, at least I think of a reason that's typically where I always think first is, you know, where's this community of people who do this type of work. So I have not studied their curriculum, so I don't know what their curriculum would entail. But the other thought that I also mentioned was, you know, we could bring liquor enforcement personnel from other states and municipalities here. And this is the beauty of being in Honolulu. I mean, you know, any liquor inspector on the East Coast would be happy to spend 8 months in Honolulu in February. So I think we can even sort of market this to other municipalities as this could be a win-win situation. This will be considered a reward for your top performer. They get to come and be an instructor, on-site instructor in Honolulu for a month or 2 months. We get the benefit of top performing experienced enforcement personnel to help us train. I also think some of the things that, you know, towards a more structured training, you know, really developing a curriculum. There has been an attempt to do that. But as you see, it's based on people writing up what they think should be done, what they think the standard operating procedure is, and they put it together. And the next person, you know, if we have a new person, they're going to change that. And then that new person comes, they're going to change that. So it's not institutionalized. What I think will be really helpful is to develop an institutionalized standard curriculum and really think through some of the, you know, how do we get the resources to teach certain things? So for example, de-escalation. There's policy first, but there's policy on de-escalation that nobody knows about. The policy itself is not terribly helpful. It basically says we should de-escalate. So it doesn't actually teach you how to do that. It just says we should do that. But there are training providers who do de-escalation training. I think the other topics that might be interesting would be, I'm sure there's a whole field of study of how alcohol influences people's behavior in public and how one should interact with them, understanding how alcohol influences behavior and how to interact with those. So there are certainly, you know, resources from National Association, from other municipalities and states, and maybe from academia. So I think we just need to be creative, think creatively about it. And but the difficulty is going to be the volume. So a lot more is going to be a combination, I think, of sending our people to structured training that the National Association or others are providing, or perhaps negotiate with other states and say, or municipalities and say, can our people join your training? So it's, I think, leveraging resources like that. It would take exploration and negotiation, but I think it's worth the effort to see what we can get out of those options.
Thank you.
A strategy in addition to structured training that I've seen and found effective in at least other industries is the idea of buddies or mentor-mentee, where you not only get training from your mentor, but you also get relationship building. You have a person that you can trust to speak confidentially, et cetera, et cetera. Was that something that you saw present, was trying to be present? Is that something that you think could work in this type of agency?
I think right now we just don't have enough experienced people. We don't have enough people, period. And I think we have basically the 3 supervisors who are more than 3 years in their role. And this was, but to leverage on that, this is also one of the reasons that's driving me to say that we should make sure we implement an existing policy that all level 3 investigators do 50% licensing, 50% enforcement, because the licensing investigators started out as enforcement investigators. They became investigator 3, and some of them moved to licensing, and then that's all they do. They now only do licensing. If we can start mixing that, we can at least get some of the more experienced people into the mix.
Thank you. Any other questions on this section? You can proceed then.
Okay. Enforcement practices. I think Commissioner Hung, that's where I'm going to, pick up on your technology. I was just struck by how paper intensive it was. And we see, and I did highlight a lot of the data issues, but you can see how that happens. You've been out all night at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're coming back trying to input these things into the computer, easily miskeying this and that. Very confusing in terms of time. You have to select a day, but your tour of duty covers 2 days. So it's 11, you started at 7 p.m. day 1, and you end at 3 a.m. day 2. You got to remember change the date if you're doing those entries. So those entry errors are not at all surprising to me, and but they really contribute to an inability to use the data effectively. So I remember thinking when I was looking at the system, I said, well, there's got to be like easier ways to do this, right? So I went online, just quickly looked at sort of GPS track, bat-based devices. I'm no technology expert, but just a quick Google search, I saw at least 12 vendors out there that do this sort of GPS-based tracking. So I think I don't know, what technology solution we are going to end up with, but I certainly think we need to start searching for one, because this is seems to me to be incredibly inefficient and prone to error.
My colleagues were amazed that technology we worked on at the year 2000 level was still in force for our staff. So I'm certain we can do better.
Right. And again, this is something the staff is aware. They say, so I asked them, what if you had a GPS-based tracking device where it just automatically logs where you go? And they said, that would be great. So. Anything else on that?
Just to comment, I do agree that for me, I don't have the tech background that Commissioner Hong has, but for me, paper intensive anything these days is outdated and inefficient. And it's prone to error, but it's also prone to less transparency and accountability. So I absolutely agree that moving away from a paper system and something digital is necessary. The GPS also seems obvious to me. And I'm hoping a relatively simple thing to research. I mean, my wife knows everywhere I go with the iPhone these days. So hopefully that's something that we can easily implement. But I do agree that would make, again, more transparency and more accountability, as well as a more efficient system.
Exactly.
Okay, proceed to the next section. Thank you.
So next section is the enforcement pattern. So I think a couple of things I'm going to highlight there. One is the data issues. And this is why I chose to very prominently say we as I present those patterns, you have to keep in mind they're only good for to assess relative sort of trends. So this seems more than that. How much more? We cannot be precise, just given the data issues, including those that I have already pointed out. But what I'd like to do, so we have this visualization of establishments that have been inspected very frequently versus never inspected, and with different frequencies in between. So I'd like to ask Mr. Prager to actually show you what the live version of that visualization looks like. And as he's getting ready, I'm going to say that if we don't have anything else, if we don't have that GPS system, at least before the investigators go out for each shift, they can look at a map like this instead of the paper DARs, the clipboards of paper DARs, and try to remember which ones, someone didn't go to or did go to, which is what they currently do. If they even just had this visualization, this would be a big help, and it's done. They can use it today. So Josh, you want to show
sure.
us?
So in looking through the data, we kind of put together this visualization in Google Earth, so we could basically have an easy snapshot of seeing where inspections were done, where they weren't. So here, basically, we have all licensed businesses from the data that were licensed for at least 100, held a license for at least 180 days. And we've colored them by basically how many inspections they got for the amount of time they were open. So you'll see some of these little green bubbles are licensed businesses that were never inspected. Whereas the other circles, they're colored green, yellow, orange, red, are businesses that were inspected in increasing frequency, basically. So green is, I believe, inspected no more than one time in every 180 days. Yellow has been inspected no more than one time every 90 days. Orange is no more than one time every 30 days. And then red is more than one inspection every 30 days on average. So this kind of just let us go get a quick snapshot, so you can immediately see there's kind of these clusters of areas that are more red, more orange. So that would indicate there are kind of hot spots that investigators go to and perform more inspections with more frequency. Whereas other areas may be, much less frequently visited, much less inspected. And, also that stands out as you can see businesses that were never inspected that are still, in close proximity to businesses that were frequently inspected. So this was just kind of a tool we used to visualize the data and looking through all the investigation reports.
So you can put one, let's look at one that's orange, red next to the green.
Yeah, so we can click on any of these points and immediately see all, the data. So this is kind of a roll up. So we see the business name, the number of times it was inspected in total was 110. And then we can see the color coding is based on the inspections per day, basically. More easy to understand perhaps is days per inspection. So this business was inspected on average every 23.9 days.
And let's click on a green right next to it.
Yeah, so here's a green. This business was inspected once every 318 days on average.
Wow, this is really impressive. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you. So we thought this was, and this, Mr. Prager, correct me if I'm wrong, this would be infinitely easy to do if your database target is all currently valid license, as opposed to during this period and some are active and some are not.
Yes, we had to do a lot of work to filter the data to look at what was specifically relevant, because the whole data we were looking at covered a wide range of businesses, many that were only special licenses that were only for a few days. Many places that have gone out of business at this time. We were able to do some filtering. So what you just saw was, as I said, businesses that at least held a license for 180 days and fell into certain categories. So we kind of got a better visualization that way. But again, a lot of it falls back on how the data is collected and stored. So it would make it definitely easier if the data entry was improved.
Well, yeah, and it's a good feedback loop in that if people are looking at it in this way, we have a reason to ensure that we have clean data and data integrity. So this will be a useful tool to at least consider, getting implemented.
Right. It's interesting because that, this data range, as I noted, they include restaurants, it's not restaurants, establishments that may have been only open part of the time during the time period. But if we're building one today for, let's say, daily use, you just, your base data is basically all currently valid licensees. That would be much easier, wouldn't require as much work, right?
Correct.
Okay. Any questions on that?
And just to be clear, this was from the DARS report database.
Yes, it was a combination of the DARS reports as well as a list of licensed inspection or licenses that have been issued to businesses.
Okay, thank you.
And to clarify, do you mean question on what was just presented or question on the section in general?
On what was just presented.
So that was presented, if you were to start something or get something like that and have GPS enabled things, would that automatically be able to sync to something like that? That would upload over time?
Yes, you could definitely relatively easily connect it to a database and a visualization tool.
Obviously, you're right, that you can change, they would change from color to color, right, depending on where they would be, right?
Correct, you could do any sort of coding, and one thing I didn't show, but I can show here really quickly is we actually did explore briefly showing routes as well. So if I turn on this layer here, you can say here's an example of day. I took one day and just plotted all the routes all the inspectors took. So you can see these paths here. You have a start point in the green, and then they go to the intermediate yellow points and then end at a red point. And you can click on any of these and see all the information about the business they stopped at. And so this again was just with kind of the rough data we had.
Right.
If you had connected it with the dedicated GPS tracking system, that would make this much easier. But it's certainly something that's easily able to be done with the right tools.
It's great.
Yeah, honestly, you have to give someone, you get someone with the capabilities of Mr. Pronger and my interest in data. I mean, we could be digging for this for the next year.
Yeah.
So, but this was really just to demonstrate that a relatively easy way to just look at, to try to equalize the inspections. And if you look at some of the data, you would see the places that get inspected a lot tend to be nighttime establishments. And when I interview investigators, I studied the data before I interviewed them. And I would ask them, so if I see that they have gone to a particular place a lot, and I look at the data to see what's nearby that's never been inspected, there would be, but then before I even talk to them, I have my answer, because those never inspected places are daytime establishments. They're closed by 7 p.m. So that's why they have not been inspected. So that was anecdotally what I had found as I prepared for interviews with the data. Okay, so any further questions on this section before I address the question on slide 51 that Commissioner Hung wanted to address?
I do have a few questions.
Yes.
And it's popped into my head as we've been showing that, and it goes to paper versus some other form of digital system. In your interviews and analysis, did anything come up regarding app-based a system so that you could be accessing this while on the road? It would all be, we're so app-based these days.
I asked them, they said it would be hugely helpful. So right now, and I think I've noted this in my report, their system, because it's paper-based, so they would go to an establishment, they have to note the time in, time out. And they have to look up the license number of the place they just went to. There's two ways to do that. You could also either do it based on a printout that's very thick. That's an alphabetic listing of all licenses, which is not terribly helpful. Or you can go back to the office and look it up. And this is just adding another extra step in what is already a rather cumbersome process. So if there's an app, I asked them, would you like that? And again, the answer was that would be great.
The zone system that was set up and that you had mentioned in your report, did you find that effective? Is that a good way to go about divvying up the island? Is there a better system that you were even seeing while you were reviewing that data?
I think that system is currently just meaningless because they have so few people. When you have essentially only 2 teams that you can send out, I mean, what does it matter? So in those times, they told me that we would just divide, like you go east and we go west. Since we're actually starting off sort of to the east side of the island, west is a huge territory, right? So right now with the understaffing situation, that zone assignment is rather meaningless. I think if and when they're fully staffed, I think I have no reason to think that that system does not make sense, because dividing it into territories seems to be a good idea. But I think if you also diversify the hours of inspection, so if you have daytime, evening, and nighttime tours, then they would, they have to figure in that difference. Because you're going to have to, again, use data to look at the licensees. Where are the daytime open licensees? Where are the nighttime licensees? And if you look at those patterns, you might want to configure your assignments differently. But I think that, you would have to look at the data to make that decision.
One of the concerns that I had in this section was the frequency of certain types of establishments being frequented. And at least from my interpretation of the data, it would appear as though some were certainly as a category, some were frequented more than others. And I would like to understand that a little bit better. So if you have any insights from your research, why that might be. My understanding is that you can visit a location for different reasons. One would be it's your night and you pick your places and you go. Second would be a complaint that comes in that says this establishment's serving minors or whatever the case may be, and you, based on a complaint, go to that location. One of the chief things that I'm concerned with is some sort of targeting of establishments, whether intentional or unintentional even, and creating a system that more neutrally allows us to do the inspections, at least putting complaints aside, because I understand that's premises specific, but putting those aside for now, and I know that's in the next section. What did you observe from the system itself that would lead to the type of data that would at least indicate bias in terms of what types of establishments were being?
So I will say upfront that I did not find any evidence of intentional discrimination. I did not. What I find is because they have no methodology and they're not using data, so you're all relying on subjective impressions. And we all know how subjective impressions of human beings are flawed because you know what you know. And we are driven by things like things that we're familiar with. I know that neighborhood, or, I know there's a spot down there that you didn't know, so let me show you. And so there seems to be a lot there. Not a lot. I mean, it was basically all subjective because there is no system to guide them, right? So they make an attempt. So they would say before they go on their ships, they would go and look at those paper DARs and I asked them, how could you possibly remember? I mean, you're flipping through like 2 weeks worth of data to try to remember those are the places not to go to. Mm-hmm. And then you go out and you park somewhere and you say, oh, you default to what you know. And I think that's a sort of a bias that's built in terms of human nature. You go to the places that you're familiar with or think are high risk. Mm-hmm. Also, and this is where that caution about the data comes in. So when we say a place looks like it's been inspected a lot, it could have been a drive-by. They didn't even go in. They went by at 2:02 to make sure it closed at 2. It could have been serving a complaint, but it's coded as a normal investigation. When somebody gets a complaint or a warning, there are follow-ups. There are, follow-up visits. There's like paper surveying that happens afterwards. If those get coded as normal investigation, so let's say an establishment got a warning, and warning requires a follow-up, so that's 2 visits, and that then, let's say, lead to a violation that then you have to serve the notice of violation, and then you have to go back and serve something else. So that's now 4 visits. If they all get coded, not as serving paper, but all got coded as normal investigation, it looks like they went to that place 4 times for no reason. So that's where that data caution needs to come in because the coding inconsistencies is one of the reasons.
No further questions, so I believe we have one more section before your recommendations.
Yes, so actually I want to make sure I address Commissioner Huang's question about slide 51, which is the strange case of the January 22nd entries. I sort of described the circumstances there, but just to simplify is I noted entries that I had questions about. I spoke to the two investigators involved. And when I went back to sort of verify the data I was looking at had disappeared. And a new set of entry had replaced it, basically. The system, the current system for DAR is such that they can only tell you when an entry was last submitted or edited. Without distinction. So that last modification could be a modification or a new entry. And you noted that I just have a lot of questions. Well, why did it disappear? Why did it disappear with a modification date that coincides with my interview with one of the investigators? I was concerned that there may be alteration of government record involved here. And that's why on the advice of Corporation Counsel, it was referred to HPD.
Yeah, thank you.
And I will say I did not find any other criminal conduct. I can say that right in the note right here. All right, complaint handling. I think the highlight there is that there's just no system for tracking. That just when you don't have a system for tracking, you don't know what happened to a complaint. And I can say this is very unfortunate. I have to think this is one of the reasons that's driven some of the more persistent complaints. Because I know if I complain about something and somebody acts like they didn't hear me, it infuriates me. It makes me want to complain more, right? So that's a human reaction. And I think going back to a theme that we had talked about, people just want to be heard. So when I take the trouble to make a complaint about something, I want my city to acknowledge my complaint and to show me that they're working on it. But if you don't have the ability to track the complaint, you can't do that. They had an internal investigator, and I think I have heard suggestions externally that there be some kind of reinstitution of that office in the liquor administration itself. I personally don't think, if I were to put an internal investigations person, I wouldn't put that person in such a small agency because it's really awkward because this is only a 30-person agency. Then you're coming into work with these people every day and you're supposed to investigate them. It makes sense for a larger organization like HPD, where you can have a separate department of internal affairs that just don't have to, like, they can come into their own office, they have their own group of people, they're not interacting every day with the people that they're supposed to be investigating. I also think if this organization is healthy or gets healthier, it should not have the volume of investigation to require a full-time investigator. So normally an investigator's caseload for an normal internal investigation for white collar issues is about 20 to 25 ongoing cases per investigator. If you have a 30-person agency, you have 25 cases, I think the investigator is probably the least of your problems. There's probably other problems to fix, right? So I think the better answer is what the city is now doing. The city is establishing a centralized sort of ombuds investigation function that's being established. So that is, I think, a better way to handle not just complaints regarding this agency, but complaints about any city agency. And I think the liquor agency's job is to keep track and become a stakeholder that demands accountability. So if they can track, they can say, we got this today, we forwarded it to the city investigator, and it's been 30 days, where's the response, right? So this changes their role into someone who's basically using that investigation service and can demand accountability. But right now, the inability to track is frustrating for people who make complaints. And also the other problem in here is also the understaffing. So the chief investigator position is vacant. So one of the reasons why complaints about enforcement is forwarded to enforcement, which is, you can see that that's not the best arrangement. I was told that had there been a chief investigator, it would have gone to the chief investigator. But since there is none, Either it could go up to the administrator or, to enforcement. And right now they send it to both.
Questions on the complaint section from Ms. Chen? Thank you, Ms. Chen. It looks to me as though we're at your recommendations in terms of
Very
your
good.
systematic review. I would, it's about 3:15, so we have about 45 minutes left. I believe we will take a 5-minute recess. We also want to, probably right after the recess, we'll call for public testimony. We do want to make sure that public testimony is taken. So we'll call anyone who wants to provide testimony.
Sure.
And then we'll leave the balance of the time for your recommendations. Okay.
Thank
So
you.
we will take a brief 5-minute recess.
Okay.
Here we are back on the record. Thank you for allowing us to have a brief recess. Before we move into the recommendations portion of Ms. Chen's systematic review, I'd like to provide the public with opportunity to testify on this matter. We do have one individual who is signed up as to this testimony ahead of time, so we'll call that individual first, and then we'll allow anyone else who would like to provide public testimony to make their appearance and provide it. Is there a Mr. Richard Baldwin present? Okay, very good. Is there anyone else who would like to provide public testimony this time as to this agenda item? Okay, Ms. Chen, you again have the floor to move into your recommendations.
Great, thank you. So in trying to structure the recommendations, it was a little bit, I had a little bit of a challenge in trying to lay it out because there are technical things, tasks to do, and then there's how you do them. So I did my best in trying to distinguish the more tactical with the more systemic, but also try to put them in categories. So I'm not sure it's all entirely clear. So if it's not, I'm here to make it clear. So I mentioned that I noted the fact that there had been a number of prior audits, and the audits had identified some of the same issues, and that's been longstanding. So one of my questions repeatedly was, why didn't things get done? Like, I don't want to make recommendations if you can't make it happen. And I really think some of that is there's a number of reasons, but I think some of it is resources, this bad cycle that they're trapped in, that they don't have enough people to do things, and things then fester, and then they get worse, and people then don't want to work there, and you have less people. And this is a cycle I don't want us to go into again. And so I also think people may not realize how interdependent every city agency is on the citywide system. So we, so for example, the recruitment is centralized. The review system is the same. That they use the same performance evaluation form. If you want to go out and procure some services, you have to go through the city's procurement system. And every dependency that you lay on something, then that's an extra layer of complication that you potentially may have. So what I try to do is I try to focus on things that, given the level of staffing, and hopefully with some help, can be realistically contemplated. And second is that they have minimum dependency on other stakeholders, but that's impossible to avoid. You're almost always going to have some dependencies. And three is improvements that hopefully can be done and are needed in the short term. So if I really try to make a recommendation, I could probably easily double the number of recommendations that I make, but then many of them would be, involving many other stakeholders, and it's complicated to make them happen. It's not like one agency can make all those things happen. So those are some of the priorities that guided my choice of recommendations. And then I put them in the categories of technology, training, investigation, enforcement practices, policy, procedures, and culture. So then I laid them out in that technical and systemic, and by category, I try to number them so that we don't have to keep referring to something as that recommendation about DAR, right? So it makes for easy reference. So I just go through them numerically. I think the technology piece we talked about, that's pretty, I think there's already much discussion on this, and it's the very least we can do is the visualization system. But certainly I think there must be tools out there that can enable something better than the paper DAR system. The key though is whatever system they get have to be able to talk to the other systems, right? So if you're going to make use of data, the data have to be able to be integrated. And so that has dependency. They have to work very closely with the IT to make sure whatever system is either procured or built can actually be integrated into the citywide system, at least certainly with other liquor systems. The other is the ability to randomize and equalize inspections. So I'm told that the new, they call it L2 system, the sort of the update to the current liquor enforcement system has the ability, should have the ability to randomize inspections. But as we all know, randomize is not random. Randomize is based on an algorithm. So how to write that algorithm, how to make sure that algorithm is up to date and fair and addresses the different types of risks that different establishments have different types of risks. So how do you calculate all that in is a big piece of that randomizing. So that's the first two recommendations on technology. I'll pause there.
I have a question on
Yeah.
your choice of word for equalize and what that means. I understand randomize, of course. What do you mean by equalize? Obviously, there are different types of establishments. There are establishments that have a perfect track record, others that don't. What do you mean by equalize?
Yes, equalizing is that what I'm hoping the next time we see that that map, we would not have we would not have the greens and we would not have the reds. We would have basically yellow and oranges. So that we don't have places that have never been inspected. We don't have places that go 360 days without inspection, yet other places that are being inspected, every 29 days. So it's about the frequency. They are not going to be all the same. The truth is that establishments are different. They have different risks. They are not going to always be the same. And you're always going to have some that's going to end up with more because, once you find one violation, it leads to other things, right? So I'm not talking about a mathematical equity so that everybody gets 2 inspections a year, but more proportionate and more sort of spread out than what we're seeing.
Well, and I guess maybe that we can have a rational res for reds, greens, and oranges in
Exactly.
geography.
Exactly. There really shouldn't be any greens, to be honest, because this is a regulatory enforcement practice, and part of the job is to go and make sure people are following rules. So there shouldn't be anybody who's never been inspected.
Yeah, and I like that distinction between daytime establishments and nighttime. Retail establishments, for example, are principally during the day. Of course, they're open at night, but most of their business is during the day. So they're in effect being disproportionately at this point
Right.
chosen because just simply their hours.
Exactly. Other questions on technology? 2 recommendations. Okay. Then there's the training, which we actually have talked about. I think the key here is to try to think out of the box about who we can get to do the training. Traditional answer has been HPD, but I think we need to diversify that. We need to bring people who have liquor enforcement experience. And I think the National Association can be a good resource. I think other municipalities and states can be good resources for us. And I think we are in a good position to explore those options.
I just make the comment that I wholeheartedly agree. I think that HPD and police enforcement generally might have some good tools for us, but we should be comparing ourselves to other liquor investigators and enforcement, and there's plenty nationwide that we can be accessing and utilizing. So I wholeheartedly agree. I think I would go back in terms of training to my prior comment with mentorship, and perhaps that's something down the road when we have a larger, more educated force that can provide that type of mentorship to incoming trainees. But for now, I think the focus on the structural training, and especially externally, is critical.
Yes, I agree.
I would only comment that I know it states in your recommendation, trainings to conduct annual training. I think for us, the more training you get yearly is better than just annually, obviously. So structure of more sooner or quicker, or 6-month increments or something.
Yes, I think
So-
there should be a regular rhythm. It has to be more frequent than once a year.
Okay.
Agreed. There should be different topics. So what you do is spread out the topics so
Yeah.
that you have the opportunity.
before we move off of this, and it's slightly moving outside of the systems review, but in terms of training, I just posed a question for the commission. Uh, Should we be involved in any way in training, or at least experience training in some manner so that we understand? I mean, we're not here day to day, but so that we at least have some understanding of what's going on at the agency level.
Well, I think that's always helpful, but subject to your availability to do that, because I'm very cognizant that you're stepping up as citizens to serve on this commission, and it already takes a good chunk of your time. And but to the extent that you can be available, at least every now and then to be involved in this training anyway, I think that is always helpful. That provides you another opportunity to interact with the investigators.
And like you said, the ride along, I don't know if that's
Exactly.
training or not, but that
Yes.
would be another opportunity.
Yes. So the next section is the enforcement practices, recommendations 4 through 7. So the 4 is theoretically easy, because it is an existing policy. It's just a policy that's not been followed for a long time. And in every respect, it really adds to the people who are able to do the enforcement. It diversifies people's experience so that they get to do both, which is what they're supposed to. So to me, that's an obvious one. I think because people have been accustomed to this division, the getting used to that for the people may not be easy, but on paper, this is about as straightforward as they come. Number 5 is, so if you get more people, you can do different times, right? So adding daytime shifts. I also think they need to do more data driven, like we have seen. So I said monthly, but it certainly could be just what we saw here, right? It could be before every shift, you take a look at what's happening, but implementing some kind of systemic regular review of data to see how you're doing on the enforcement, like we have done here. And then the tracking criminal citations outcomes. So this comes out of one of the issues that I had noted, which is we're not sure. The investigators tell me they're not sure what happens to some of the citations that they have issued, particularly with the shoulder taps, the underage drinking. So if you don't know what's happening, you really should, because that would inform what you do. I mean, if none of your criminal citations are being followed through by the prosecuting attorney's office, that tells you something. So at least you should be able to find out why. And you might want to ask, should you continue to do it? If they are indeed being followed up, but not at, the percentage rate that you might expect, you would want to check, why is that? What's your, is there something in the way that we're doing it that's causing some of this? So I think following up just the outcome of the criminal citations that they do issue would be informative about that practice. So those are the enforcement practices recommendations.
I don't know if this is an appropriate place for it, but at least in my private practice experiences, I've noticed that a lot of the licensees complain that they just don't always understand the rules or understand how they're being enforced. So what's the balance? And I don't know if you looked at this in this analysis or not, but what's the balance, or should there be a balance between enforcement and education, and providing some sort of opportunity for licensees to better understand the rules and how they're being enforced? Is that something for enforcement to do? Is that something that's more systemic that we should do as an agency policy? Where does that fit in?
So my understanding is actually audit does some of that. That's my understanding, is that audit does some of the auditing section. They actually go out to some of the new licensees and try to educate them. And I think, but I don't know the extent, because that really wasn't the focus of my reviews. I don't know the extent that education goes. I think it's a good idea. I think some of enforcement itself certainly can be educational, particularly for people's first time offenses, right? So if you have someone who's a relatively new licensee who's just not familiar with the rules, it's the first time they've been found with something that's not terribly serious. I think that could be naturally an opportunity to educate. But I think some of that can also go into the public engagement, which I'll talk about a bit more.
So one of the things I think you touched on earlier was the policy of warnings versus violations, right? And a warning seems like it would be a good time to get the attention of the licensee to do training,
Yes,
because that's the first of the first.
Yes.
If you got kind of one of those.
yes,
And it seemed like there was not a good systemic, uniform way of conducting the warnings, or was I reading too much into your?
there doesn't seem to be. Yeah. I also think, so for example, information such as how new the licensee is relevant here. And right, so it could be an establishment that's been there for a long time, but they recently changed ownership. So even though it's a long time establishment, the licensee there is new and not as familiar. So that kind of information, if we have a good digital system, should be readily available, and that'd be part of the calculation in terms of, what do you do in these situations?
One of the byproducts I would hope to see if education was at an enforcement level would be the community relationship. As you said at the outset, was sometimes enforcement's going into a situation that could be dangerous. That's at least when they're walking into a bar at night, the licensee is putting flags up. Oh, liquor enforcement's here, and I don't know how much of this is possible, but I would love to see a good relationship between enforcement and the licensing community, so they're not seen in that way, and they're trained to not act in such a way.
Yes, actually, we don't have to be rigid and go numerically. So that's precisely what's behind that public engagement recommendation. I think it would be helpful if people have a chance to, the investigators and the licensees and the public. So they don't just serve the licensees, there's also the licensees' neighbors, the community at large, have an opportunity to interact in a way that's outside of that enforcement environment. So when I was an in-house compliance officer, my job was to go and conduct internal investigations, and oftentimes you investigate and you have to tell the general manager that they have to fire their star performer, right? So I always tell my team and people who do that job, make sure that you also establish relationship with the general managers and the senior leadership when you don't have an investigation. Just stop by their office and ask them, how are things going? Because you need to have that relationship with them. That helps you see each other as people. And if you only see someone when they're potentially violating rules, that creates a tension that doesn't go away. It only exacerbates over time. So I think that's, that's true with not just enforcement, it's true with licensing, it's true with auditing. It's always better when people get to see their city public servants as people. And for the people who work in city agencies to think about the public as not those people who I have to be enforcing against. It's a broader view of the community. And I think that's why I put that in there. I think that's one way to change, build trust and change relationships, is for you to have opportunities to interact with each other in a non-enforcement, non-licensing, non-auditing type of environment.
Great, thank you. And one of the concerns I have moving forward in this process with recommendations and implementing them is this idea that, people come with certain presumptions or certain biases, and that leads to a direct miscommunication or misunderstanding between the licensee and enforcement in this example. And then that leads to an escalation, and then we have a problem. And I think if we have a process systemically to have broader education, have the ability for more public dialogue, I think we can avoid that from the outset.
Yes,
So that we're not placing either party in a position
exactly.
of escalation.
Exactly. Completely agree. Let me come to investigation. they have to have a system to track complaints. I don't care if it's an Excel spreadsheet, but a centralized way where one place you can look at when it came in, who made it, what it was, and what was done with it. Hopefully, when the city builds its investigative function, that their responsibility would pretty much end there, would then go to the city investigation function. But, you know, there's part of that system is also making sure you respond to complainants when you can. So sometimes complainants are anonymous and you can't get back to them, right? But those who choose not to be anonymous do so for a reason. They want to be heard, and they need to have a system where they are able to say what happened with the complaint.
When it comes to complaints, one of my general concerns is the anonymous complaint and the ability that could be used as a tool for someone in the public to abuse it. How is that addressed? I don't know if you've gotten to this level in your recommendations, but how is that addressed in a systematic way?
I have not gone into that level of detail, but typically, you know, as an investigator, I always say, it's not really the source of the complaint that, you know, the source of the complaint is one consideration, because if you have more information about the source, you can assess how credible it is. But my first focus is always the validity of the complaint. So the first thing you always try to do is to corroborate a complaint. And complaints, just in my experience, generally, they come in at all different levels. And some you are going to have to accept are not actionable, right? Somebody calls and says, an investigator was mean to me. Well, what are you going to do with that? So, you know, that really you can't. But if you have a way to communicate, this person chooses to do so by email, for example, you can at least email the person back, well, which day, which investigator, and at least give you some place to start. And then if you do that, you don't get any response. I don't think anybody can tell you that that's an actionable complaint if you haven't made those efforts. Then there are anonymous complaints that are actionable. They give sufficient information for you to corroborate certain details. And then you look at the records, you look at data, you interview people, and you do your traditional investigation. You should be able to, you know, address it. It's addressing it doesn't necessarily mean that you get all the answers. A lot of times, I would say I've done investigations, the result of which was they raise more questions, but I cannot get to the answer. In part because when we do these investigations, we don't have police power. I can't call people into a grand jury and make them testify. So I don't have any of those tools. I can't issue a subpoena and look at people's bank account. So without those tools, a lot of times your investigative inquiry can only go so far. But at least you have to go that far. You have to be able to say that I have chased this to the ends of my ability. And I may not have answered all the questions, but here's what we know. Okay, that's on investigation. Then number 9 is policies and procedures. I think someone just needs to sit down and give it a good scrub. And some of the specific ones that align with the technology and training and enforcement practice and investigation, I have sort of put it there underneath them. So they should certainly have a policy to mandate randomized inspections. And then perhaps include further definition of that equity that we were talking about. There is a there is an existing policy that mandates a monthly production of 12 months training plans. I personally think that may be a bit much, because when you do something that routinely, it becomes part of the wallpaper and people don't take it seriously. So I think it's probably more effective. They simply just have an annual training plan that looks 12 months done, fix it, and you look at it again next, 12 months later. But they should do it at least every 12 months. They should have policies that mandate, they should have and actually enforce the policies that mandate rotations. And the policies, the existing policies they have on complaint handling needs scrubbing, needs some cleaning up and clarification. And policies that are outdated should be removed. I did include later some overall questions to ask in that exercise. I think for every policy and procedure revision, those questions need to be clear. Why do we have policies? Who's going to be responsible for them? Who's supposed to do the tests? I mean, this is one of the issues I found in some of the complaint policies is it says something shall be done, doesn't say who's supposed to do it. And you know, when you don't say that, nobody does it. So that's the first slide of the recommendations. That's 1 through 9. I'm going to move to the next slide. And
Yes, please.
okay, the next slide is is all about culture, and that's recommendations 10 through 17. I do know, so even though recruitment is centralized, the recruitment and the promotion, you have to use external stakeholders. I do believe that the agency itself has the ability to change the questions. So I think there should be people who are sitting down thinking about what are the questions that are really relevant in our hiring and promotion, and put those in there instead of some of the ones that we currently see. The cross-functional, so that was number 10 on recruitment and promotion questions. Number 11 is establish cross-functional working committees for policies and procedures and project management. That is an attempt to get people to work together, because I do see such distrust, such division in this small organization. One of the things that we have to help people do is learn to work together. And also, doing it this way gives them a voice and a stake in the outcome. So I also know that from at least one of the interviews that a lot of the past way of addressing policy is to hire an external vendor, have that vendor produce a whole set of policies and adopt it. That gives no one in the agency any voice. You get the copy and paste policies from HPD, and that's not all relevant to the work that's going on in this agency. So to change that, you want the policies to be relevant, you want the projects to have active stakeholders, and you want to get people to work together. And I think that's the way to do it. And earlier in the policy part, I specifically recommended that in areas where we need expertise, we can certainly get external expertise. And one of the ways that you can mediate the internal differences is to have these working committees, some of them at least chaired by an external person. And we all know how it is that you and I can fight, but when we're in front of a stranger, we feel like we have to sort of tone it down a little bit, right? So I think I want to leverage that dynamic, that we're going to have some external expert who can provide expertise, but also that ability to mediate. We're going to also, in certain policy and procedures, other stakeholders like the city investigations person or core who will be part of the mix. So now you have more sort of outsiders in front of whom you have to sort of tone things down a bit. I'm hoping to create those dynamics that would help people learn to work together. That's the thought behind that. Number 12 is the ride along, on which I think you all seem to be in agreement with. Honestly, to push that further, I would even say that someday when there's better sort of working relationship, they might even consider the same concept for people who work in different parts of the agency. So someone who works in licensing, do one day shift at the front desk. Someone who is at the front desk, do a ride along with the enforcement. So they all get to know each other's job a little bit. So you can push that concept a little further, but I think we can start with the commissioners, and we can play with that idea of just walking in someone's shoes. And public engagement we already talked about. And then there's a bunch of more systemic ones. So I do think there should be much more clear probationary and performance standards, so people know what they're expected to do. We talked about diversifying the cultural orientation beyond HPD. And then Commissioner Buckley, that's really to your question about, I sort of put that, it's number 16 out of 7. It's not in order of importance, but it's sort of, I think, a longer term. It's not as pressing in my view. as some of the policy, the internal policy procedure revision, for example. And then the unlicensed premises, I do think that, needs some clarification. I asked them, what do you do with unlicensed premises? The answer is like, well, we can't do much. And I feel like that's potentially creating a lack of equity in some way as well. So if I have a license, I actually have all these rules I have to obey. But if I run an unlicensed premises, I can do whatever I want. That doesn't seem right to me. If that's the case, I think that, that needs to be looked at a little bit more. So those are the thoughts behind the 17 recommendations. I'll pause there and see any questions and comments.
I just had a comment when you were talking about collaboration under number 11. To me, it represented for the employees a sense of ownership. Of course, not ownership in an equity sense, but I have the ability to own this, own my position, have the ability to contribute meaningfully to the organization or agency as a whole. And that goes to the confidence in being able to do your job well and thrive in your environment. So I think the collaboration aspect is very important.
I was just thinking about the enforcement options for unlicensed premises. I was thinking we're a regulatory agency for people that want to be regulated, or you're a criminal enterprise that's doing something outside of the regulatory scheme, and that's the division between our inspectors and HPD.
Yeah.
Would be my initial kind of thought.
Exactly. And then there may be, just a clarification about who is supposed to do what. But there just seems to be a little bit lack of clarity on what's happening there.
I don't know where exactly this fits, and apologies, it's probably not fitting under culture. I probably missed it above, but one of the things I've noticed, and I was reminded by number 16, update the liquor rules, is over time, things have been inserted into the administrative rules for liquor investigators to investigate at premises that aren't what I would consider liquor related. Their building permits or their health, and this is evidenced probably most clearly in the emergency order when everyone just said liquor, you handle it.
That's why I call it the perfect storm.
Yeah. So where should that responsibility lie? I mean, I understand that liquor investigators are out there so they can be utilized, but to me, it doesn't, if they don't have the proper training in some other department, they shouldn't be enforcing rules that are related to something that's not like it.
I think this is where, we're talking about that dependency with other city agencies. This is a very clear example of that. So how do you have a relationship and structure where you can refer certain matters? So if it's a building permit, how do we work with DPP? What is the process of making a referral? How do they follow up? How do we ensure they follow up? Those are, and I probably would make more recommendations in those areas if I didn't think there were just too many dependencies to be something that we can accomplish, in the near term. But I agree that that's an issue. And I also think it's important that we think about, as we pile on things for investigators to do, then we can't blame them. Like back to my cook in the beginning, right? The cook in the kitchen, like, in addition to having no recipe and a rusty pan and a hot plate, now you're asked to go and serve tables, and you're not doing a good job at serving tables. And now you're being blamed for serving tables, which was never part of your job to begin with. So I think that was a little bit of what happened during COVID. So again, it's not their fault. I think it's the system. We were also, of course, dealing with a pandemic that no one in our lifetime has experienced. So it's not something that anybody on this planet has experienced with. So it was extraordinary, but unfortunately, it does create a good case study, unfortunately, for what could go wrong.
Yeah, and I can be empathetic to some extent with the investigators, because for the emergency COVID orders, I didn't want to be up here as a commissioner doing adjudications on those issues because they didn't really feel like it was our place to do that. So,
and the rules were changing all the time, and there was, there were public health rules, and it was a confusing situation, I think, for everyone. But they were thrown in the midst of it.
Thank you, because I do think that there needs to be a clear distinction about what's appropriately liquor and what's not appropriately liquor.
I agree.
And it seems like that's been blurred over the years.
Yes, I agree. I think we're doing very well on time, seems.
Well, we've only got 5 more minutes, but any other wrap-up questions or comments from the commission or from you, Ms. Chen? Any other wrap-up comments?
No, I don't. I think the only thing I would say is that I think it's important that the commission doesn't feel the pressure to adopt all recommendations in equal weight. So I do think it's an important discussion that you need to have with the administration, the liquor administration, so the agency, about what our priorities and what things are realistic, which things are more easily done. And that is something that, you know, people who are in the job to be able to provide that perspective a lot more. And I want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. What we want is to make this place where good people can do good work. And what we don't want is to make this place that no one wants to work at, because we all lose in that case. So I think we have the possibility of changing things. We can change small things, and small changes can lead to big changes. We don't need to be terribly ambitious. Pick a few things, start there, but do them well. And I think we can have a path forward that can ultimately improve what we are experiencing. So thank you again.
Any final comments or questions from the commission, from Ms. Chen?
Just our deep appreciation for the work and the analysis. And this will be so helpful for us to have guidance for the future.
Thank you.
Yes, and Commissioner Hong mentioned this at the beginning, and I'll just put it in your ear at least. Well, 2 things. One, this was focused on the investigative side, but we have a licensing side as well that we haven't really touched in terms of a systematic review. Is that something that, I know you haven't gotten into it too much with your review here, but is that something that you feel like would be appropriate and you would be available to do it? And the second comment would be some sort of review at a future date, whatever would be appropriate, a year and a half less, where your team could come back and assess the changes that are being made and implemented, how those are doing and what's left to do.
I think everything is possible. But I think my initial view on the licensing question is I might suggest getting a little time just to get this whole project sort of on the way and let the agency, because this is going to be disruptive for licensing too. Certainly, if you choose to reactivate this policy, that mixes their time, right? So it's going to be disruptive, and people will need time to get used to it. So you might want to think about giving it a little bit time for things to, at least that piece, to settle a little bit before moving towards it. There is some data in there that's already telling you something about the licensing. There, you know, about the number of complaints that they have. I think there are certainly there's going to be need for time to settle things a little bit. I think coming back in the future, always happy to. I also think the city auditor can be a part of that solution as well. I was careful not to, careful to tell everyone in this review process that I'm not an auditor. I wouldn't know how to do an audit if my life depended on it, because I'm not trained that way. And audit has different methodologies, but I think that's also part of the audit city auditor's function, and they can certainly help in part as well. So I'm happy to do it as I have done it a year from now, or 18 months from now, whenever you want. I can also partner or work with or assist the city auditor in doing something. So I think those are all things that are options.
And I guess my final question will be, and it's a follow-up to that question, and the reason I ask it is it's quite obvious from your report that this has been systemic for quite some time. There's been a lot of turnover over the years, just by its nature with the commissioners come on and off. There's been the turnover in fact vacancies at the highest positions currently. And there have been attempts to make changes with varying successes over the years. We as a commission certainly want to ensure that this is done and it sticks. And so we want to develop, in addition to the recommendations, working through which recommendations we're implementing and in what order, we want to ensure that there's a process that will ensure that these are done. And so maybe as closing statements, if there's anything that you would like to speak as to that.
I think you touched on a point that we have talked about from the beginning, which is the notion of institutionalized practices. My sense from this review is that there's a lot of things that are personality dependent. And literally, you know, I have heard employees say that someone new comes in, everything starts from scratch. That's not what we want. We want consistent institutional practices that can be changed and modified, but subject to a process. So this is why I normally am not someone who's crazy about policy and procedures. Usually I find them like burdensome, boring, and all of that. But I can't believe I'm middle of a review where the centerpiece of my review, I almost want to say, are the policies and procedures, because they do form the backbone. That is where you're supposed to go when you have questions about how we do things. And that is supposed to stick. And this is so we have to have a way to build institutional memory, institutional practices where people form this mental habit of, but what does the policy say? That's absent right now.
Thank you very much. Okay, with that, we are at a little after 4 p.m. So we will adjourn this special hearing. We'll take a brief recess and then we will come back for our regular hearing today. So thank you again very much, Ms. Chen. We very much appreciate your report, your diligence, and all that you've contributed to helping this agency better itself.
Thank you again.
And with that, we are adjourned.